filed by Stephen Tess before a quorum of the California Board of Psychology, case number 600, 2017, 00628, OAH case number 2017, 080, 061. Today is November 16, 2017. It is 2:22 p.m. and we are in San Diego, California. May I have your appearances, please?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Your Honor. Martin Hagan from the Attorney General's Office on behalf of Xavier Becerra, the Attorney General of the State of California.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hagan.
And good afternoon, Your Honor. David Leatherberry and counsel for Dr. Stephen Tess, who is seated here to my left, and I'm going to just ask him to stand because I know he's a little bit buried. So, thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. I know that I have a set or a packet of exhibits, pre-marked exhibits 1 through 8, and absent any objection, I'll receive these exhibits into evidence.
Just as we discussed prior to the hearing, I wanted clarification on the record that the evidence is being admitted for all purposes without objection, and we stipulate.
Well, let me just clarify a couple things here. One is we had a brief discussion with Mr. Hagan and counsel regarding documents I think that you are intending to offer. At some point, you were showing those documents to Mr. Hagan, and we would discuss that further on the record. Right now, we're discussing the packet of materials that I have and the board members have copies of. And so with respect to that, there's, again, 8 exhibits. I note that one is identified as Exhibit 7, which is the disciplinary guidelines, which I'll take notice of absent any objection. Otherwise, Exhibits 1 through 8 are admitted absent any objection, which I don't hear the parties making. So that's our record at this time. If counsel, you want to present additional documents, you may do that, or argument regarding how the documents are going to be received, that's fine as well.
If it pleases the court and the board, I think for efficiency it might be helpful to just discuss the 2 documents now, since we're dealing with just 2 exhibits. And
well, I don't know what I don't have. I don't think I have what you're referring to. So why don't you identify this document that you want me to make part of the record, I think, so that I know, and if you can hand it to me so I know what we're talking about, which Mr. Hagan has a copy of.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And this is a letter from a Mary Sheets, psychologist, dated November 8th, 2017. It's a front and back letter, and there's copies here for the board members, which I'll hold on to for this moment, and I'm just going to ask, so you're offering this, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor, we'd like to offer that as Exhibit 9.
Okay, so I'll mark this as 9. Any objection, Mr. Hagan?
Well, I just say it's cumulative at this point, but that would be my only basis for objecting.
Well, the objection's overruled, so Exhibit 9 is admitted. And what I'll do is I have copies, and I'm just going to hand these to the board members, if you can pass them around. I'll give these to you, and I'll just give this to you. And I have a copy, and again, I've marked this and admitted it as Exhibit 9. And I also have a resume of Dr. Tess's, which is with a summary of experience and achievements. I just have this one copy.
Yes, Your Honor. I unfortunately do not have copies of that. We are offering that to supplement what we believe is the resume that was put in the original packet, which is now somewhat dated. I don't intend to refer to it. It's really just for the board's convenience.
Well, so what I'm going to do, well, I'll ask, and I'll identify this as 10. but we'll need copies of this for the board members, but I'll first ask Mr. Hagan if he has any objection to it. You're offering this, I'm assuming, as a separate exhibit?
That is correct, Your Honor.
Okay.
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay. No objection to 10. I've marked it, and I'm looking for somebody to help me copy here. I'll get this copy. I'll get copies to the board members of this CV. Okay. So with that, the burden of proof is on, oh, can you make copies of this? Thank you so much. The burden of proof is on petitioner, Dr. Tess. Counsel, how would you like to proceed?
Your Honor, I'd like to make a brief opening, if I may, and then call my first witness.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we do this? Why don't you call your witnesses, hold your fire on your statement. I'll give you time in your closing to make a statement. But why don't you call your witnesses?
Happy to do that, Your Honor. Thank you. We call Dr. Stephen Tess.
Doctor, I'm going to swear you in, please. If you can please raise your right hand, excuse me. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the state of California that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, counsel.
Dr. Tess, please tell the board, and I want to clarify first, this is not my role to stand in the time to talk to the board. This is your time to talk to the board and be seen and allow them to ask questions. So please tell the board, how long have you practiced professionally as a psychologist?
I have been licensed since February of 1985
Where do you practice?
in El Cajon, California.
And could you describe the clients that you treat in El Cajon, California?
It's predominantly what would be considered a underserved population. It would be made up of a lot of low-income individuals, a lot of people who are developmentally disabled, and a fair amount of geriatric clients.
And are you still seeing patients of that population?
Yes, I am.
And are there ways that, well, let me ask you, how long have you been practicing in the El Cajon area with this population?
Since 1985.
And are there other ways in which you work either professionally or avocationally with the underserved of El Cajon?
Well, I also, in actually a role that's very different from being as a psychologist, I am the president of the board of directors of a nonprofit healthcare center in San Diego, and I've been affiliated with that center since 1974, where I was one of the co-founders of that clinic, and I've been continuously involved with that clinic ever since. And the mission of that clinic, which has really evolved into a healthcare center, is to be serving a culturally diverse, underserved population of San Diego County.
And when you say, just to clarify, low income, so these are patients who typically either are unfunded or receive Medi-Cal, or they're homeless, is that correct?
Yes.
And the clinic where you volunteer as the president of the board of directors, is that just mental health, or what services are provided?
No, it's a multitude of services. It's mental health, it's medical, it's dental, it's optometry.
And so would you say this is it an FQHC clinic?
Yes, it's an FQHC, which is a federally qualified healthcare center.
And these are set up to essentially serve the poorest of the poor, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, in June 2014, you agreed to a stipulated settlement with the Board of Psychology, is that correct?
That is correct.
And that was as a result of a number of boundary violations, is that right?
That is correct.
And just so that we can save time, I'll lead you through some of these, but these included, for example, working with a patient who showed up one day who was distraught and demanding to smoke marijuana from a pipe, is that correct?
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
Your Honor, if I may, we're just reviewing the accusation to save time.
We can read the accusation. The board members can read the accusation.
Okay, we can do it that way then.
To save time, you can go on to your next question.
Okay. So were there a number, is it safe to say there were a number of events that occurred?
Yes, with one particular patient.
And between what years, what period of time?
Well, I saw this patient from June of 2002 until January of 2012, and so the incidences occurred during that time period.
Were one of these boundary violations an accusation that you consumed alcohol while the patient smoked marijuana?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, do you recall as a result of the board action, the disciplinary proceedings in approximately November 2015, meeting with the Dr. Veronica Thomas?
I do.
And who is Dr. Veronica Thomas?
She is a psychologist who is on the Board of Psychology evaluators panel for doing psychological evaluations. And so I met with her for that purpose of getting a board-ordered psychological evaluation.
As a result of that evaluation, were you required to seek psychological treatment?
No, I was not.
Were you required to seek substance abuse treatment?
No, I was not.
How about alcohol abuse treatment?
No, I was not.
Have you had an opportunity since meeting with her to review her report to the board?
I have.
And do you know what her conclusion was regarding whether there was any evidence of your abusing alcohol or drugs?
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
Party admission, Your Honor?
Sustained. Objection sustained. Move on.
Okay.
Counsel, the point I'm making is that the case has been tried, that we're not here to relitigate the case.
Correct.
So why don't you ask your next question?
Thank you. My apologies, Your Honor. We certainly don't mean to challenge any of the underlying findings, but to bring out findings that have not yet been disclosed. Looking back on your conduct, working with this patient, and the statements, the allegations, the accusations in the in the board's accusation, how do you feel about those accusations?
Well, those accusations are correct.
And have you had an opportunity to give any thought to the events that contributed to those accusations?
Every day.
What sorts of things, if you could tell the board, what contributed to your, let me summarize here, just so we're clear. How would you describe, if you could generalize, what went wrong? What was the underlying problem that caused you to get into trouble?
I think there were several factors. Probably the most important factor was there was a softening of boundaries that occurred in the therapeutic relationship over those number of years that I saw her. As I noted earlier, it was 9.5 years that I saw her. That was over 500 sessions. And I think very subtly but surely over time, there was a softening of boundaries that occurred that resulted in a kind of a laxity developing in that therapeutic relationship. And that laxity resulted, I believe, in a lessening of firmness that I needed to have with her at certain times. And those times would be particularly when maybe she was in crisis or going through some emotionally difficult times. And so that softening of boundaries did create, I believe, a laxity. And I believe what also happened along those lines was that I got too much pulled into her emotional pain. After all those years of working with her in all of those sessions, I knew just about every detail of her life, and she'd been through a lot of very difficult, traumatic events in her life. And I believe I'm a really compassionate, empathic person. I became a psychologist because I really wanted to help people. The problem was, well, on paper, it's great to help people. I made the mistake of trying to help her in the wrong way on several occasions. I believe I had good intent in trying to help her, but I ended up trying to rescue her when she was going through some crises in her lives. And so that was certainly a mistake on my part in terms of how I tried to help her. I think other contributing factors to what went wrong was that the nature of the clientele that I would be seeing during the course of my career was, as kind of mentioned earlier, it's a underserved population. The type of people I've tended to see throughout my career are people who often have problems with very basic issues such as housing, transportation, trying to just pay their basic bills. And that's in addition to the difficulties that you'd expect a client to bring in, which would be the emotional, psychological difficulties. And I think what happened because of the nature of that population, I started to get out of the strictly clinician role, and I started to wear maybe another hat, and that hat maybe be along the lines of almost a social worker or a case manager. And as a result, then, another aspect I believe that created of a softening of a boundary or a loosening of a boundary, getting out of that strict clinician role. I think another factor that contributed to what I did wrong was the issue of fatigue. I had, throughout my career, I've often had a very full caseload, especially of often pretty challenging cases. And I was often referred cases from other referral sources, which were challenging. And so I had a lot of those in my caseload, and I chose to see those types of clients. I really did. And amongst the most difficult, challenging clients were the ones that were from the Child Protective Services, CPS. And for 27 years, I saw quite a few of those cases. And as I look back, those cases, I think, were very draining to me, especially the older I got. Not quite having the energy level as I got older as when I was a younger psychologist. I think another thing that contributed to my fatigue, and I think the fatigue's an important factor to note, because when one gets fatigued, again, it can lead to kind of a softening of boundaries. And it can lead to maybe a lessening of firmness that you need to have with a patient. But another aspect of that fatigue factor was that I was volunteering a lot all throughout the years. Excuse me. And again, I chose to do a lot of volunteer work, and that was a lot of volunteer work, both in my personal life, but also through a lot of professional activities. And while they were very gratifying, those volunteer efforts, I can look back and see that it was probably also creating some fatigue for me, especially as I got older. And then another factor I believe contributed to my fatigue was that my father died in 1999. That left my mother living alone in the local San Diego area. And from 1999 to the point where she died in March of 2012, I took on increasingly more responsibilities in looking after her. And then the final year and a half, 2 years of her life, basically like the mid part of 2010 to March of 2012, her health deteriorated, and I took on even a much greater role in trying to look after her. And I think that also took a toll on me in creating fatigue. And then I think a final factor that maybe contributed to what I did wrong was I think I relied too much on getting caught up in being a very experienced clinician. Again, I've been licensed almost 33 years. I've been in the mental health field almost 46 years. And while experience is a wonderful thing, it can be a two-edged sword in the sense that I believe as I got more and more experience, I started to maybe not really realize I was probably relying too much on my own experience, especially as I had success in maybe getting a lot of clients through some difficult challenges, including this particular one. And I probably was relying too much on myself and not looking enough at other resources to assist in helping me with clients. And those resources being that social service agencies that could have helped out probably with her on some of those basic living needs I mentioned. And also I was probably overlooking the importance of me on kind of an ongoing basis, just consulting with colleagues, just to make sure I was always on the right path and self-monitoring correctly. So again, I think that experience kind of created a little bit of that difficulty in relying, again, too much on myself, especially in trying to get her through crises.
Dr. Tess, you mentioned a term regarding wanting to rescue, and you spend a lot of time volunteering, whether it's through the community clinics or through other services. Have you given any insight or given any thought into how that desire to rescue may have contributed or may contribute to a potential future risk of crossing boundaries?
Well, yes, I've thought about, ever since the initial complaint was filed 6 years ago, probably every single excuse me.
Would you like to take a minute?
Okay. I've thought about probably every single day what I could learn from this situation. And what was really difficult was I really felt, and I still do, my intentions were really good in trying to help this client. But that rescuing that client was the wrong thing to do in terms of not maybe even recognizing, especially as she made progress, and she made a lot of progress over those years. But I did her, I think, her a disservice in, especially when she made a lot of progress and still maybe not recognizing she could probably get through some of these crises a lot on her own because of the progress that she had made. And I feel like, in retrospect, I probably deprived her of some of the confidence that maybe she should have developed, that she could get through those crises on her own. And so I've really come to realize, you know, the way you help is everything. The intent to help is good, but the way you help, it's got to be done in the right way. And in some instances, I did not help her in the right way.
What, if anything, have you done to make sure and to assure the board here that if they were to shorten probation, that you would not repeat past mistakes?
Well, I've done a lot of self-examination in terms, talked to a lot of people. I've been in San Diego since 1971. I have a lot of colleagues I've known over the years, going back not only years but decades. I've talked to a lot of them. I made the decision when I realized I was going to go on probation that there was one or two ways I could go. I could go through probation, kind of do whatever is necessary to meet the minimum requirements, try to stay under the radar, and just kind of meet the requirements and then just get through it. or I could really try to step up to the plate. You know, I was really embarrassed about what I'd done. It was very hard. Very hard for me to face people who I felt had a lot of respect for me. And I felt like, no, I need to step up to the plate, and I need to take full accountability and really learn from what I'd done wrong. And so I made a point going on probation, this was a little over 3 years ago, that I would do everything I could to learn from what I did wrong, not go under the radar, to not only try to educate myself, but to try to maybe educate others, particularly peers, as to what maybe they could learn from my situation.
Let me pause you for just a moment. You used the term going under the radar. What do you mean by not going under the radar?
I felt it was important for me to be open up front about my situation, so I approached many of my colleagues to let them know what had happened, even though it was very embarrassing for me to do so. And then I also decided that at some point I needed to take another step by going before bodies of people to make a presentation of my situation.
And so by bodies of people, was one of those bodies the annual CPA convention in 2015? Or was it 16?
It was 2016.
And what happened there?
Well, I was invited by the California Psychological Association to make a presentation, if I'd be willing to, at their annual convention. And the presentation would be at their all-day ethics and law seminar, and it'd be where I would do a presentation on my case, what happened and what I'd learned. And I had to really think about that. I talked to people. Some people said, do it. Other people said, are you nuts? Why would you expose yourself to that? And one of the people, quite frankly, who told me I really didn't need to do it was my wife. I've been married 31 years. She's also a psychologist. She's my office partner, one of my office partners. She said, Steve, you don't need to subject yourself to that. And I normally listen to her, but on this one of the few occasions I went against her suggestion, and I decided I would make that presentation. And so I did about an hour presentation, again at the April 2016 CPA Ethics and Law Seminar. And it was difficult. I mean, I remember sitting in the audience beforehand. And just like my voice is cracking now, and I apologize for that. I know my stomach was in knots. I could feel myself shaking, but I knew I had to do it. And it was the right thing to do for me to get up there, because I knew this presentation was important, because it really would be a reminder of what I'd done wrong. Hope to get me to learn as much as I could and maybe help other psychologists avoid what I did. So I did that presentation.
And to be clear, in your presentation, did that involve your making a disclosure regarding the accusations that had been filed against you?
Oh, yes, that absolutely was contained in my presentation.
And was that I won't say verbatim disclosure, but was it an accurate disclosure of what you were accused of doing?
Yes, I gave a summary right off the accusation, all the bullet points.
And did you talk about what led to those failures on your part?
Yes, I did.
And what was, if you know, some of the reactions that you received in response to your giving that presentation?
Well, I'd like to say that I wasn't sure what type of reactions I would get. You know, I'd hope maybe people may have, after they heard my presentation, they would maybe, you know, think, well, you know, that was helpful to hear that. I wasn't sure, though, what type of reactions I would get. After my presentation, people did come up to me, quite a few people, and they said, wow, that was really courageous to do what you did, especially because I was looking out in the audience there, and I've been a member of CPA since 1989, and this presentation was in 2016.
Had you also once been on the board with CPA?
And I'd been on the board of directors of CPA for 2 different terms. And I was looking out in that audience, and there's people in that audience I had known for years, if not decades. And I was going, oh boy, what are they going to think of me? And I really had a lot of pride in my reputation. But people came up to me afterwards and very positive comments about, well, that was very courageous. That was really helpful to hear maybe what you've learned. And so I was really pleasantly surprised by the positive reaction.
Are some of those reactions contained in the letters that you have submitted in support of your application or petition for early termination?
Well, I know at least 1 or 2 letters, there's comments on that, yes.
And have you done presentations other than the CPA presentation?
I did another presentation earlier this year, May 2017. I did a presentation in San Diego as an all-day ethics and law seminar conducted by Ellen Stein, who's a psychologist. She does an annual workshop on law and ethics and has for years. She had asked me if I would do a presentation at her workshop. So this last May I did do that. It was about an hour and 15-minute presentation. There were about 90 plus mental health clinicians present. And I did a similar presentation as I did at the CPA convention.
Has anyone, either from the Attorney General's office or the board, told you that you had to go out and do these public displays or disclosures, a better word, of what occurred and what you've gone through and why it happened?
No, that was never in any of the requirements of my probation. Nobody from the Attorney General's office or from the Board of Psychology ever even made the suggestion. I just did it on my own.
So why do it?
Several reasons. One was it's a great reminder of what I'd done wrong. Number 2, it gets you to really critically have to examine why I did what I did. If I have to go up there in front of peers, I have to be able to explain to them what happened. And if I didn't explain it, I can tell you the questions that were directed at me would be asking that. And then my hope was that maybe, I think I noted this earlier, that I could maybe help maybe some other psychologists avoid the pitfalls I'd fallen into.
And as you sit here today, we're in San Diego, your practice is in San Diego. Are some of your peers here present?
They are.
And how does that make you feel to stand here, not just in front of the board, but in front of your peers in order to and admit wrongdoing?
It's difficult, but I appreciate the support of them being here. But it's still difficult for me to admit this to people I know. Because again, I've really prided myself in what I think has really been a very good career, not just in my professional conduct, but in my personal ethical conduct.
So sitting here today, having a chance, having the ear of the board, Why is it you believe that you should have early termination of probation?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the community that I serve has been affected. Again, I deal with a very underserved population, low income, a lot of developmentally disabled individuals. And I also work in a geographical area, it's east of San Diego, where there is comparatively few clinicians. Quite frankly, it's not an area that most psychologists would care to practice. And so there's not enough clinicians really in the geographical area that I serve. And I feel like being on probation, it's affected to some degree my ability to see as many of those clients as I'd like to. I feel that, first of all, some referral sources may be reluctant to refer to me knowing of my probationary status. And so those people, I worry, may not be getting referred to me like they would have before.
Does that include Medi-Cal?
Well, Medi-Cal, I lost my privilege of being a Medi-Cal provider because of the initial complaint. I would very much like to become a Medi-Cal provider again, but there's no way I could become a Medi-Cal provider while I'm on probation. I also feel like being on probation that it has cut into my time in trying to satisfy the requirements, and so I do have less time that I can devote to scheduling patients. And so I think that it has affected the community I see. Another reason I like to request early termination is I feel like I have really taken my probation very seriously. Not only by trying to go beyond the minimal requirements. I mentioned the case presentations. I am, by the way, in April of 2018, will be appearing again at the CPA annual convention at the Ethics and Legal Seminar. I'll be doing my presentation again. And this time I'm taking even another step further, that I am going to have my name and picture in the program with my topic. When I did the presentation a year and a half ago at CPA, I was not ready to have my name and picture in the program. And I was just announced at the workshop, we're now going to have a guest speaker come up. I was given that same option this time, and I said, no, I need to be in the program with my topic. I need to have my name and picture in there. And again, my wife, who I normally listen to, she said, Steve, why would you have your name and picture in the program? And I said, because it's the right thing to do. I did not want to be under the radar, and I wanted to show full accountability. And I've also, in terms of trying to go beyond what's merely required by, I've taken in the 3+ years that I've been on probation, I've taken 16 ethic-related courses. I've been mandated to take 15 hours a year, which would be 45 hours for the 3 years. I've taken 74 hours of ethics-related classes or coursework in this time. And I've taken these courses very seriously. I've not just passively listened to them. When I do one of these courses, I am really actively listening because I want to learn everything I can. One of the, I think, more relevant courses I've taken was one called Ethics and Boundaries in Psychotherapy. And on that course, I got a 100% score on the post-test involving 21 questions. And so again, when I go to these workshops, I listen. I really try to learn what I can. So I've tried to take my probation very seriously. Another reason I'm requesting early termination is I've mentioned my role as being president of the board of directors of this healthcare facility, San Diego Family Care. And I ran into a problem a couple years ago that could have really affected that role that I have. And again, that role has nothing to do with me being a psychologist. I'm the president of the board of directors. And what happened a couple years ago was we were undergoing a major expansion of our services, and we had to apply to the State of California Department of Health to get certification. Being the board president, I am the final authority. I'm the final one to sign off everything. And when we submitted our request for the expansion, there was a delay. And as far as we could tell, the application was red flagged, and it appeared it was red flagged because of my probationary status. I had to provide an explanation to the State Department of Health as to what that was about. And that was certainly, I felt really bad about that because this was affecting this patient population that this nonprofit healthcare center serves. 110,000 patient visits a year. It's rated, we were visited in a inspection by the feds last May. We were rated in the top 1% of federally qualified healthcare centers in the United States. And I felt awful that my actions maybe could have jeopardized this expansion. The expansion was approved ultimately, but we're looking to do another expansion in the very foreseeable future. And I really worry about that expansion being delayed again because of my probationary status being a red flag. Another reason why I'm requesting early termination is that I feel I can safely practice. It's been 6 years since the initial complaint was filed. I feel like my career has really overall been a very exemplary career. And I feel like that my character has been exemplary. I definitely made mistakes in this case, which I need to be held accountable for. But I feel like that is not representative of who I've been throughout my overall career and who I am as a person. And I have 11 letters of support that have been submitted by colleagues. A lot of them have known me not only for years, but for decades. And I believe every one of those letters indicate that they feel I can safely practice. So those are the reasons why I'm requesting early termination.
Dr. Tess, the question was asked earlier today. Recognizing that under probation, some individuals flourish and some do not. Would you say that probation for you was a positive experience?
Oh boy.
I set you up with that one.
Yeah. Well,
let me rephrase it.
No, I can answer. Okay. No, I'll answer it. I don't know if I'd use the word positive because I know as a board, you have to know it's very difficult for anybody that goes through this process. It's very difficult in so many ways, emotionally, psychologically, financially. So I wouldn't say it's been positive, but I will say this. Believe it or not, I think it's been beneficial. And beneficial in that, well, I think I've always been a very good psychologist. I think going through this process has actually made me become even a better psychologist.
I think with that, we'll go ahead and rest for now.
I'll ask board members if they have questions, beginning with Ms. Brunel.
Good afternoon, Dr. Tess.
Yes.
I'm very familiar with the FQHC model,
okay.
And I really do understand that you would definitely wear multiple hats, not very close, like a social worker as well. Mm-hmm. How would you go about not falling back into the social worker role?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, just getting into the difficulties I did with my wrongdoings, that right there was a huge wake-up call, because I had to certainly look at how did this happen. And I certainly saw that as one of the things that I believe contributed to what happened. So I've tried to do is make some changes as a result of that recognition. So what I've tried to do is, when I get any new clients particularly, but really any clients that I still have, to look at very, very carefully on an ongoing basis, am I starting to get out of the strict clinical therapist role that I'm supposed to be in? I'm constantly self-monitoring myself now for that. And if I start to even have any hint that I'm getting into wearing another hat, like a social worker role, I immediately tell myself, no, I need to make sure that I refer them on to some other resource, and there's lots of resources in the community that I can refer them to, for them to go to get help with these other basic daily living problems. So that's one of probably the main things I've done, is just to be that self-monitoring and then making referrals to other resources.
Any questions, Dr. Warren?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Dr. Tess. I wrote questions down as I had them, so I hope it's not too disjointed. I'm going to give a little disclaimer before I ask you. So I want to start with, you were talking about what supports you have in place now to keep something like this from happening again. I heard you just say that sounds to me like you were saying you were more aware now. If you're moving from one role to another. So when you talk about a strict clinical role, what do you mean?
Focusing on what should be the treatment plan, the clinical treatment plan. What I was trained as a psychologist to do, which is to deal with emotional, psychological issues, and not to be going into areas that are outside the realm of a psychologist, such as maybe a social worker or case manager would do. So I try to keep my focus, and I'm constantly self-monitoring. Am I staying within that clinical role of looking at the treatment plan and the clinical interventions and the treatment progress, and keeping it focused on the clinical portion?
Okay. In talking about other things that you have in place, from reading the information that is in your packet and hearing you talk today, it sounds like the places that were in place, or the supports that were in place when this happened, are supports that are still in place. And yet, at the time, I don't think you accessed those supports.
You're right on the mark, and I've really come to realize that. Again, I think, as I mentioned, in terms of what I think was a contributing factor, I think that when it came to colleagues, I was not, I look back in retrospect, I was not kind of on an ongoing basis consulting with colleagues like I should have. I think, again, getting caught up in my feeling that I'm very experienced, I know what I'm doing. Gee, I'm getting through a lot of these clients through some very difficult, challenging circumstances, and I think I relied too much on my experience. And then I think in terms of other supports in my life, my wife, I mentioned, we've been married 31 years. She's a clinical psychologist. She works with me, same office. And I think I wasn't using her enough either, I think, in terms of talking to her about clinical issues. I believe that I felt that, gee, when I was done with the workday, try just get into being a husband and a wife. And I think I wasn't using her enough to be able to just check in regularly on just clinical issues. And so I've gotten really good at utilizing her now, at just saying, hey, this kind of came up during the course of the day. I wonder what your thoughts are about that. Do you think I handled this right? or I wonder if maybe this is going on, and I'd always be very aware of confidentiality, so I would just kind of describe the issue without ever identifying, of course, the patients. So I've been utilizing her so much better, and she's been fine with that. I also have 2 other office mates, and I've also been utilizing them a lot more. So I am in a group private practice, and I realized I wasn't utilizing them as much as I should have, and just kind of ongoing consulting and bouncing things off them.
Do you have a regular peer consultation group or anything, or is it just kind of when something comes up, then you go to somebody more informally?
Yes, it's more than formal. And again, I do have people I've known for years, if not decades, and like I said, I'm much better now at reaching out to them and just talking about, what's going on.
Okay. At any point in this process, when the boundaries did get blurred and you acted in these ways that were clearly inappropriate and outside of the, say, psychologist role, was there ever a time in there where you thought, I'm in trouble here, or maybe I need help, or this isn't how I would usually respond, and yet I'm responding this way to this woman?
Well, I can actually tell you with the marijuana alcohol situation, that was June of '09. That was 7 years into our therapy. I knew immediately I had messed up on that. I couldn't believe it that I had done that. I mean, I was very angry with myself, quite frankly. I was very upset with myself. And so that really got my attention. Prior to that, actually, I felt that she'd been making a lot of good progress. I was actually proud of the progress that she'd been making. But that definitely was a real eye-opener.
And so was it after that you hugged her, kissed her, or was that during that?
The kiss was then in November of 2010, which would have been about a year and a half later. And that was much different circumstances than the alcohol marijuana situation.
So when you knew in that alcohol and marijuana situation, when you knew I did something wrong here, right? I mean, that's
Yes.
what you're saying?
Yes.
Did you go talk to anyone at that time?
I did not right away, no. In retrospect, that was a real mistake. And that's probably one of the real things I've learned. Quite frankly, I was very embarrassed. I also knew that I'd certainly done wrong, and I knew in my mind and heart I would never allow anything like that to ever happen again. Something like that had never, ever happened before in my life. And I knew in my heart and mind I would never allow that to happen again. But I also was going to see what would happen in our next session after that. Certainly if my patient had come in and at the conclusion of that session, if I'd felt this was still going to be a problem, that I knew in my mind I was going to absolutely have to talk to people. But she came in, we definitely processed that situation in terms of, what I had done, what she had done. We both agreed that it could never happen again. And I said, all right, let's see how it goes. We'll take this on a week-by-week basis. And so I felt, and again, in retrospect, I should absolutely have consulted with somebody after that. Down the road, I did start talking to people about it kind of on a one-to-one basis. But that was a mistake not to have talked to people. I kind of deluded myself into thinking, well, it seems like everything is okay. And she did continue in therapy without missing a beat. So I rationalized, well, I guess everything's okay as long as I don't do it again. And I knew I would never do it again.
But then you did hug her, kiss her once. So what was that?
Well, the hugs were, there was probably about 10 occasions of those. And that was when I, again, was in retrospect, trying to rescue her. These would invariably be situations where she would be in the session, distraught, despondent, and by the end of the session was still very, very down. And she was actually the one who requested that I give her a hug. And I'm not a touchy-feely person by nature. And so I, say, well, I really rather not do that. But she goes, I really feel I need that. And I go, so I gave in. I shouldn't have. And that was that softening of boundaries, that firmness that was slipping. I should have said no. But I did it with the idea at the time of trying to comfort her when she'd literally sometimes be trembling at the end of the session. She'd be so distraught about something. And it just seemed like whatever verbally I tried to say during the session had not been enough to comfort her. And so that's what the hugs were about. And then on the kiss, that was in, again, November of 2010. And that was at a point where, while she'd made really good progress over many years, she came into that session really distraught. And she was very upset about, it looked like she was going to be evicted, and she didn't know what was going to happen to her. It was also being November, the beginning of the holiday periods, which are always historically very, very difficult for her for a number of reasons. And by the end of the session, I had not been able to really, I felt, to be able to get her to feel less distraught. And so as the session was ending, I had a spontaneous thought in my mind. I would give up as we were ending the session, give her a pat on the shoulder and reassurance like, well, things will get better. And then for whatever reason, as I went up to give her the pat on the shoulder, I made a spontaneous decision to give her a kiss on the cheek. I had never done that before with her. And again, in my mind, all I can think of was, looking back on it, I was trying to comfort or validate her. In some respects, I kind of felt like maybe I was kind of a father figure to her. And unfortunately, in giving that kiss on the cheek, when in itself I realized was inappropriate, but I already did it, her mouth or her face turned, her head turned at the last second, and our lips inadvertently touched. And I'm going, oh, great, although I wasn't even sure if they did touch because it was so quick. But I knew then that even a kiss on the cheek was not appropriate. And so, again, when I saw her in the session the following week, we certainly processed that. And after I explained to her what my intent was, she seemed to be okay with that. And again, I told her, of course, that will never happen again, and that any type of contact thereafter absolutely had to be a handshake. She readily agreed. And so we continued again on a week-by-week basis to see how the therapy would continue. And it did seem to continue well with her continuing to make progress.
So at that time, did you ask a colleague, say, hey, these couple things happened, I don't think it'll ever happen again, but let me just run it by you, or anything like that?
Again, I was embarrassed, and I rationalized it, and definitely was a rationalization as I look back on it, that, well, she seems to be doing okay. She still wanted to continue in therapy. She seemed to still be making progress thereafter. But in retrospect, of course, I should have consulted with somebody. That's one of the things I've truly, truly learned, that consultation you can never have enough of.
Okay. Two more questions. One, you said that being on probation and having these probation requirements has really cut into the time that you have available for clinical work, see your patients. At least that's the impression I got.
I hope I didn't use the word really cut into. I would say cut into. So if I said really cut into, I would use the word cut into. It's because I do have the requirements of the weekly practice monitor. That's 1 hour a week. There's reports quarterly that I have to submit on those. I also have the requirement of doing 15 hours a year of in-person ethics-related coursework. And that can really, those workshops are only really done Monday through Friday. It's very unusual to find one on a Saturday. So almost always attending those workshops are during the work week. And I've had a hard time sometimes even finding workshops close to where I live. Again, they have to be in person. If it was online, I could just do those on the weekend or in the evening. It wouldn't cut into patient time. But I do not want to imply that it's really cut into, but it has had some impact on reducing my availability for clinic hours.
Okay. But you actually did over what was required in terms of those courses. Were they all in person as well?
I don't have the exact breakdown, but certainly I would just estimate about half have been in person and about half online.
Okay. And so I have one other question, and that is, what is your CPA topic for the workshop in April?
Well, if I can recall, it's a firsthand clinical presentation of a board complaint and findings. Now, that's what I submitted. I don't know if that's going to be the final title, because CPA has the right to make any changes, and that's what I submitted as my suggested title.
Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Phillips?
Hi, Dr. Tess.
Hello.
I get the impression from what you described as being the stressors in your life at the time that this all happened, that you were under an enormous amount of stress and felt kind of burned out. Is that fair?
You know, I'd hate to say burned out in the sense that burned out to me implies maybe you're not being effective in terms of treating patients. I think I was still, in terms of my clinical interventions, in terms of treatment planning, patients making progress, I think I was still doing a very good job. What I was not doing a very good job was self-monitoring some of my own dynamics in terms of maybe how my dynamics and maybe the patient's dynamics could be affecting just the relationship between us. But I was getting fatigued, no question. I would rather use the word fatigued versus burned out.
What commitments have you set aside since then?
Well, one thing is that on the personal side of my life, I have 2 children. They're both grown. The last one left the household in 2011. So a lot of my volunteer efforts on a personal level were things that I did on behalf of my children. And so again, in 2011, my second child moved out. So I've done no more volunteer efforts involving my family because of that factor. I've become much more careful also in what I commit to professionally in terms of volunteer efforts. And my main volunteer effort really is being on the board of directors of the San Diego Family Care. But that's really been a mission I've been on, and it's something that I'm able to handle, I feel, because I get a lot of help in that role from other board members and from the staff. And the only other really commitment I have is being the chairperson of the Community Mental Health Committee of the San Diego Psychological Association. And that committee only meets every other month.
Okay. What are you doing to prevent yourself from getting overtired, overstressed, overfatigued by your work beyond giving up commitments?
Well, one thing I do now, which I did not do before, is I actually build in breaks now in my work schedule. I used to, quite frankly, even work through lunch. And I just say, well, I'll take my lunch if and when a patient cancels or no-shows. I now build in lunch breaks. I now build in other smaller breaks during the course of the day. And so that I have a chance to really not only get a break, but even stop and see, okay, how are things going so far today?
Okay. Now, you mentioned that your position as president of the board of directors of the clinic had jeopardized funding the last go-round, and that you're anticipating more funding, a need for more funding in the near future. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you give any consideration to stepping down as board president, given your history?
I asked the other board members, they know my situation, and they said absolutely not.
So they're willing to take that risk, and you're taking
They
that
just
risk.
reapproved me for another 2-year term last month.
But it is an option. If you're really concerned
Yes,
about...
it is an option, yes. And again, if I thought that was wearing me down, I would certainly give it up. But that's actually a position that, it actually energizes me, believe it or not, that involvement.
The pattern I'm noticing in a lot of the things you're saying, including what was happening around the time that these incidents of boundary violations came up, is that you see yourself as being the only one available to do the job. And I'm wondering if that's not the same with the board of directors.
No, as I just mentioned, is that we have a very active board. And so, in fact, my style as board president is I actively involve all board members. We have a very strong committee structure. And so as board president, I am able to delegate a lot because of the way that our board directors is set up, and my style is to be very democratic. And so I am very, very good about delegating responsibilities to the other board members and to the staff, and they're very happy to take on those delegated duties.
You said in your narrative statement that one of the problems you ran into with the client was you were kind of assuming, since you'd been working with her for so long and had so much therapeutic progress, that you felt like you were the only one that could help her, or you didn't consider the fact that there might be alternative people to help her. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
I think it's more the latter. It wasn't that I didn't feel like I was the only person that could help her. I think I just got, without really consciously analyzing and self-monitoring, realizing, no, wait a second, there's other resources out in the community that could help her or my other clients with some of these basic living needs. So I think it was more of that.
Okay. And there were a number of different boundary violations, correct?
Yes, there were.
And some of them really struck you as being, oh my God, what did I do?
Yes, I was very upset with myself.
Did you consider referring her to somebody else?
Well, yeah, that's why especially after those two situations were mentioned, the marijuana, alcohol incident, and the alcohol, that absolutely was on my mind, because I didn't know what she would be like when she came in for the next session after each of those two incidences, and I was fully prepared to say to her, if for any reason you felt, or if I even felt from my own observation, that this therapeutic relationship could not work effectively, I was prepared to offer her referrals.
Okay. But you never did offer her referral?
No, because we processed what had happened on both situations, and then she kept saying, no, I want to continue in our therapeutic relationship. And I said, well, okay. I said, but again, we can continue, but we're going to take it week by week, which we did do. Okay. And I'd often check in with her. Okay, how are you doing this week? Do you feel comfortable coming in here?
But during that monitoring period, there were then again additional boundary violations, right? So these things happened not all at once, but over a course of time.
Yes, they did.
And they were serious boundary violations.
Yes, they were.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And your client was developmentally disabled?
No, she was not.
Oh, she was not.
No, she was not.
I misunderstood that. She was just...
no, a lot of the people I work with, but no, she was not.
Okay, but she had serious emotional illness when she first came to you?
Yes.
Okay. You emphasize the fact that you'd like to better serve the underserved population. That's the population you've worked in. And probation may, to some extent, interfere with your ability to do that?
Only to some ability.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you feel like underserved populations are as worthy of consumer protection as other populations?
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I feel like that has been my focus. That is my almost like my mission that I've been on and what I want to do, what I want my life to stand for is I made a difference with people who have not had access to services like other people. It's almost like how I was raised. It's almost like what's in my DNA. And it's just who I am.
Okay. Do you have any trepidation about making future boundary violations?
Of course I do. Yes, and that's, I never would have thought I would have done what I did in this case with these violations. And so that's why every day I think about what I did. That's why these presentations that I've started doing are so important, so that I don't forget what I did. And I do learn whatever I can. Yes, I'm human, and I realize I could make a mistake again. What I want to try to do is minimize to the maximum possibility making any future mistakes, especially if it could harm a patient.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Jones?
Dr. Tess, good afternoon, and thank you for presenting. And just so you know, I feel like I just want to say we're looking at the packet online, so I know that we're on the computers.
Okay.
But I also want to just acknowledge that I could tell it was difficult as you talked about some of the challenges, and you just said that you were upset with yourself. As a follow-up to what Dr. Phillips said, I guess one thing struck me is that, as you described the vulnerable population that you serve, the upset about the services that they've received. And so, as you said, it talked about fatigue and softening of boundaries and kind of described the notion of rescuing folks. Have you done any kind of audit in terms of the other patients that you've served? Because again, as you described, most of the people you serve are developmentally disabled and elderly and folks that I would imagine, as you described yourself, as one of the few providers in the area, you probably have long-term relationships with other clients, perhaps. And so I guess that's a question mark at the end, but I just want to know, in terms of how you feel in terms of that population and kind of how you've reviewed your work with other patients.
Well, yes, I do certainly have other people I've seen for a long period of time that are from that population category. What I've tried to do, though, is because of the mistakes I've made, is especially with the other people I see, whether they're underserved or not, is I'm constantly self-monitoring myself now on the dynamics that might be within that session. My own dynamics, the dynamics they may be presenting to me, and if there's any change in those dynamics. And if I feel like, for whatever reason, that I'm not the best person for them, I think I'm more willing to recognize that and to make referrals. And I have referred people out now that I probably would not have referred out before, recognizing that there's other people in the community, there's other agencies that can serve these people.
And I guess my final question is, as you were talking about the notion of fatigue, and I think you also couched it in the sense of, as you have grown in your practice and you've gotten older in terms of your patient caseload, a follow-up again to the question that was just asked about in terms of probation being able to restrict your ability to do your services. How great is that a hardship for you?
Well,
or burden, I should say, not
yeah, I mean, I'm not a young man. I'm 68 years old. I don't have the energy that I used to have. And it is emotionally, psychologically, it's difficult. But I put myself in that position, so I'm the one who needs to take accountability for that. But that being said, it does kind of take a toll on me in terms of just, emotionally. And I do want to try to monitor myself that I don't let anything that might fatigue me, including being on probation, affect my patient care. And so again, that's why I've tried to really make some changes, like putting breaks into my schedule, which I'll continue to do whether I'm on probation or not. And I'm more selective too. and which patients I now take. Again, I think without really thinking about it, I started getting kind of caught up in, well, I'm very experienced, I can handle this case. I'd never take a case I didn't think I could clinically treat, but I think I'm more willing to look at, well, I can maybe clinically treat this person, but is this going to be maybe an extra workload on me in terms of the other difficulties they might bring in with them? So I recognize much more when I'm kind of doing an intake on the person. Is there more than just the clinical stuff that's here? And those people are much more apt and willing and have been referring out to other resources.
And so I guess the last piece, I guess, what the last question as you presented was about it being beneficial. So again, it's been a beneficial process or on probation. And so I think in terms of when you look back on that benefit, as you called it, a beneficial time, not, what was the question? I forget what it was. Do you flourish or not flourish? It was like you said, thought it was a beneficial time. Do you think that set of circumstances has helped to be a support to you, to be able to be the best, as you said, even better psychologist?
Yes, I think as painful and difficult as it's been to be on probation, yes, it has made me become a better psychologist. It's really got me to really look at my own dynamics and to realize, well, again, I always felt I was very well-intentioned, and it's so important to help patients. You got to help them in the right way, and I've really learned that. And I also feel like maybe I can help other psychologists too. Like I said, I made a decision that I'm not going to go below the radar. I'm going to come out and I'm going to make the best of this situation, make good come from bad. And if I can help even one other psychologist avoid the pitfalls I did, then that's really worth something.
Dr. Erickson?
Hello, Dr. Tess. I have a few questions.
Sure.
Listening to your, I'm noticing that you've made considerable effort in these seminars you've given or talks you've given are certainly worthy of note, and clearly part of what can be one's rehabilitation or learning, in this case about boundaries. I think, or I thought I heard a theme with this patient that you saw for many years, that both with the kiss and maybe with some of the hugs, there was she had the pattern of not being comforted enough by the end of the session. And I don't know what that stirred up in you, but it sounded or seemed, or maybe I inferred, that you wanted to try to do something more, give her a hug or a kiss to make it better. Does that sound
Well,
true?
if I understand your question, I think it's a good question. What I felt was that during this session, I used, as you normally do in therapy, of course, verbal approaches.
Sure.
You provide feedback. You try to structure the session to get to whatever the issues are, and then try to help the person through what you verbalize to the person. And I guess I felt at the end of those particular sessions, when the hugs occurred or the kiss, that what would be the normal, customary interventions, providing a verbal intervention, somehow had not been enough to comfort her or to validate her. So all I can think of is I thought, well, maybe if I gave her some other type of gesture, maybe a physical gesture, maybe that would be an added type of comforting. I certainly realize, looking back now, how that was very ill-advised, and that is not the way to try to comfort or validate somebody.
Okay. I'm not sure, I may have not heard or remembered, were you mandated to get therapy for the first year of probation, or have you been in therapy during this probationary period?
No, when I had the psychological evaluation done in November of 2014, the psychological evaluation said that therapy was not necessary.
Okay. And I wanted to ask a little bit about the issues for the motivation for wanting to end probation early. I was trying to list what I thought I heard or generally heard, and it looks like the issues could be, and there's multiple reasons, of course. You'd met the requirements of rehabilitation. Maybe there was nothing further to do or to learn. It has a burdensome aspect to it in terms of time, money, embarrassment, and so forth. And maybe the fourth or fifth one is knowing that you can safely practice at this point. And of course, everyone would balance those and say, well, this is more important than that, or many people would. Can you identify which one seems to be the most worthy reason for you, or the two or three, if it be the case, for suggesting this is the time to get an early?
Well, I think certainly a feeling that I am safe to practice. I certainly should still be on probation if I felt, or others that know me felt I wasn't safe to practice, then I should still be on probation. I think that jumps out. I hope I didn't imply that I feel like I don't have anything more to learn. I feel like I absolutely have more to learn, and that process will continue whether I'm on probation or not. Just like the presentation I've already committed to do for CPA this April. I'm going to do that presentation whether I'm on probation or not. The presentation I plan on doing in May for Ellen Stein, I'm going to do that presentation whether I'm on probation or not. No, I see this as I'm going to be learning something all the time. So I hope I did not imply that by being off probation, I feel like I've learned everything. I feel like, no, there's a lot I can still learn, but I do feel like I have learned a lot.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions at this point.
Ms. Badu?
No questions at this time. Thank
Dr.
you.
Kasuga?
I just have a few questions, and just wanted to start by saying, to comment that I appreciate that you're trying to help other psychologists prevent some of the pitfalls that you have. I think that's really helpful for individuals in the field. My question relates to, you mentioned the term softening boundaries is one of kind of like the ethical issues that happen with this particular patient of yours. I get the idea that it's kind of like sneaked up on you, that you were like softening or breaking boundaries, and then afterwards it's when you realize that, you know, you can't believe that you've broken those boundaries? Or was it like over time that the boundaries of...
I think the softening of boundaries happened over a number of years. And again, I started seeing her in '02, and as I looked at it, I think a certain kind of laxity started to develop because of the familiarity, that it was very subtle. I feel that softening of boundaries, but that when the laxity became problematic, obviously when there was a boundary crossing, which indeed happened, that's when it became a real problem.
Would you say that the self-monitoring that you were doing, you mentioned earlier that you felt like you didn't do a good job of self-monitoring, and did you feel that like self-monitoring is enough to prevent the softening of boundaries from happening in the future, just doing a better job with self-monitoring? Or are there other lessons from the ethics courses that you have taken that can help you prevent, you know, this softening of boundaries?
Well, yeah, I think the self-monitoring is very important because that's something that I can do all the time on my own, and so that's very important. And I can assure you, probably on a daily basis, I do that. But no, that's not enough. There also has to be where the consultation, as I mentioned earlier, I've come to realize I was not making enough use of the resources around me, of the colleagues that I've known for a long time, not making enough use of my wife, who could be an excellent resource on talking to about what's going on. in terms of my clinical practice. So the consultation part is very important in watching out for that softening of boundaries. And so it certainly goes beyond just the self-monitoring.
I also have a question regarding the work you were doing with this patient. Was boundary one of the treatment goals for this particular patient?
Yeah, she had a history of being abused, and so anybody that has had abuse, that is an issue of boundaries, yes.
So that was one of the so how regularly did you like evaluate kind of like
I'm sorry, how often what?
do you evaluate treatment goals with this particular patient? Did you I guess I'm trying to figure out if like after this boundary incidents, breaking of or softening of boundary incidences happen, did you discuss kind of like changing treatment plans or
Well, I
addressing
certainly on
the
my
boundary
own would
issues?
look at it continuously, but I also with her, I think I mentioned earlier that after each of those two incidences, the marijuana, alcohol, and the kiss, that we kind of continuously thereafter, I'd kind of check in with her. How are you doing right now? How are you feeling about where we're at in the therapy? Not just the clinical part, but how are you feeling comfortable still? And so that was something I would continuously check in with her on. But also outside of the therapy session, be just looking at not only her case, but my other cases, especially the ones people I'd been seeing for a long period of time.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I guess before we proceed, let me just ask, I know Mr. Hagan's going to have some questions, and I'm not limiting you to questions, but I'm going to just ask if the members feel we need to take a brief break before Mr. Hagan proceeds with his questions. We need a break, so...
I can tell you, I'm going to try to motor through it pretty quickly, because I know the board's got
Don't
another
try,
matter.
motor through it.
Okay.
And so, so why don't we take our 5-minute break, and we're off the record. After a brief break, and Mr. Hagan will proceed with his questions.
Good afternoon, Dr. Tess. Now, you began treating patient CM in June 2002, correct?
That's correct.
And based on her date of birth, what I've seen, she was approximately 42 years old at the beginning of your course of treatment?
Yes.
Okay. And you were approximately 52 when you started your treatment with patient CM, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so there's roughly about a 10-year age difference between the two of you?
Well, yeah, I think it's 10, 11 years, yes.
Okay. And I'm assuming that you had a higher degree of education than patient CM?
Yes.
And you also made more money than patient CM?
Objection, relevance, and speculation.
Overruled.
Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And I'm assuming that she did not have any professional degrees, or she was not a professional of any sort. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you were the treater and she was the patient, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, patient CM's history included abuse and molestation as a child.
Yes.
She also had a history of sexual abuse.
Yes.
She had also been abandoned by her family.
Yes.
She suffered from depression.
Yes.
She also had bouts of suicidal ideation.
Yes.
Okay.
Objection, Your Honor, this is all on the record, hearsay.
Overruled.
I mean, we've
And also she had a history of prior suicide attempts, correct?
Yes.
Now, the patient also had a positive history for substance abuse, is that right?
Yes.
And that included crystal methamphetamine?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Sir, let me go ahead and direct your attention to the petition and direct your attention to page 315. Let's see if I... Did you recall giving a prior statement in this case to one of the investigators?
One moment, counsel. Let's get to the page where you are so we can share. You said AGO 315?
Yeah. Yes.
About where on the page?
Let me direct your attention to page AGO 315 at line 2, and you were asked about whether the patient had a history of substance abuse. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And then on line 8, you responded to that question, and you indicated that she had a history of marijuana and crystal methamphetamine. Do you see that?
Yes.
Does that refresh your memory of her having a history of using crystal methamphetamine?
Well, the crystal methamphetamine was before she was ever in treatment with me. So
But
that
she's-
was in her earlier adult years.
Okay, but in her earlier adult years, she had a positive history for substance abuse, which included crystal methamphetamine and marijuana.
Yes.
Now, would you agree that this patient had a complicated past medical and psychiatric history?
Yes.
Okay. And given the disparity between the two of you and her complicated history, how do you think that she could truly process the kissing incident that took place between the two of you?
Lacks foundation, calls for expert opinion, which is not present here.
Overruled.
Could you repeat the question?
Let me ask the court reporter if she'd be willing to repeat the question or read it again.
You stated the disparity between the two of you and her complicated history. How do you think that she could truly process the kissing incident that took place between the two of you?
Well, at that point in her therapy, that was November of 2010. She'd been in therapy with me for, that would be 8.5 years. And by then, she'd made a lot of progress in her therapy. And so her ability to assimilate something was certainly a lot better at that point than would have been earlier on in our treatment.
Well, wouldn't you agree that somebody with a history that included abuse and molestation as a child, sexual abuse, and abandonment, that could be a traumatic experience when she's kissed by her therapist?
Yes, it could be.
And during the course of your treatment, you hugged her on at least 10 occasions.
Yes.
Okay? And the hugs would last approximately 2 to 3 minutes?
Well, no. The hugs, there was a combination of hugs and sometimes holding her. The hugs would be just for a few seconds. The holding might be for a couple of minutes.
Let me go ahead, sir, and direct your attention to your prior statement that you gave to one of the investigators. And I'd like to go ahead and direct your attention to page AGO 322, lines 15 and 16, and have you take a look at that.
I'm sorry, counsel, page again?
322?
Thank you.
Do you see that, sir?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And when you were asked a question about the hugging, you indicated that it would last for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Did I read that correctly?
The holding would be for 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, so you would, when you hold her, you would hold her for approximately 2 to 3 minutes?
That would be my recollection, yes.
Okay. Now, on June 29th, and I'm not going to go through all the boundary violations, but on June 29th, you permitted patient CM to smoke marijuana in your office. Correct?
Asked and answered.
Overruled.
When you say 229, I'm not sure what you mean.
I'm sorry, 2009.
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
And you did this despite her history of substance abuse.
Yes,
All right? And you never documented this encounter in your medical records, did you?
that's correct.
And you never sought a referral at this point in time, did you?
That's correct.
Okay. And then on November 16th, 2010, you had the incident where you kissed patient CM on the lips. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. And you kissed patient CM on the lips despite this history of sexual molestation, sexual abuse, and her history of abandonment, correct?
well, yes, that history was there, yes.
Okay. And you didn't document this incident in your chart notes, did you?
That's correct.
Now, about 1 week later, on November 23, you had a discussion with patient CM about the kissing incident. Do you recall that?
Well, I don't remember if it was November 23rd, but it was the following week or so, yes.
Okay, and you didn't document this discussion in your chart notes, did you?
That's correct.
Nor did you refer out to another mental health provider at this point in time, did you?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, on December 28th, 2011, patient CM brought her sister with her to the scheduled visit. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
Again, Your Honor, we are not here to retry the underlying facts. These have been stipulated. They've been discussed at length already by board members. Given the lateness of the day, I think we should have a little bit of clarity as to where we're going.
Well, I'm assuming there's a foundation, these are foundational questions, and Mr. Hagan's getting to a point which he's been making, so it's the objection's overruled.
Thank you.
Now,
Without prejudice.
patient CM's sister told you that the holidays had been difficult for CM, correct?
yes,
And patient CM's sister also told you that she was upset about the alcohol and marijuana incident,
that's what the sister said.
okay? And you didn't document this discussion in your chart notes, did you?
That's correct.
And you didn't refer out at this point in time,
That's correct.
okay? So you would agree that you conducted, or there were multiple violations of the standard of care?
Yes, I would.
You have multiple boundary violations,
Yes,
multiple failures to document your improper conduct with patient CM?
yes,
Now, was your failure to document these incidents done with the intent to conceal your professional misconduct?
no, I would not say that. It was because, first of all, I was embarrassed for sure, but I was thinking more that at the time, this was my rationalization, that the situation had been taken care of. And that was an erroneous thought that I now realize. But I thought we continued on in therapy. She seemed to be doing well. And so but yes, I should have documented it. I've learned that was a mistake.
And you would agree that your failure to document these incidents could be perceived as an attempt to conceal your professional misconduct?
Relevance? Perceived by whom?
Overruled.
I guess it could be seen like that.
Okay, and also, if you didn't refer the patient out, that could also be another possible form of concealing professional misconduct, correct?
I guess it could be seen that way.
Now, I think you've admitted this, but do you believe there is a potential for long-lasting emotional harm when a therapist kisses a patient?
Yes, there is the potential.
Being
Okay.
ambiguous. Wait a minute. That question is completely improper hypothetical.
Now, is there a greater risk of
Let me
emotional
roll on the
harm?
objection. The objection's overruled, and yeah, it's relevant.
Is there a greater risk of emotional harm in kissing a patient who has a history of sexual abuse, molestation as a child, and family abandonment issues?
Well, I think potentially.
Now, what type of emotional harm could a patient under those circumstances suffer?
Well, it could possibly re-trigger recollections of their own trauma. It could be confusing as to the role of the therapist.
Now, in your petition, you indicated that you were attempting to model behavior for her. And this is at page AGO 13. So are you claiming that your boundary transgressions were a misguided attempt to model behavior for her?
Yes, they were.
Again, Your Honor, just for the record, it's a completely, apologies.
Again, Your Honor, just for the record, it's a completely improper hypothetical. I understand the court's ruling.
Well, you can't make a statement. Are you asking me, are you making an objection, or is this just a...
I am making an objection, and just for the record, request a ruling. Thank you.
Okay, well, I have to make a ruling on it. So I'm overruling it. It's foundational. It strikes me as a foundational question. Mr. Hagan is getting to another point based on something in the record. So the objection's overruled without prejudice.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Now, you also indicated that...
I'm sorry, one of our members has a question. Ms. Badu?
Yes, I just wanted to repeat that, what I said earlier.
You want who to repeat what? Ma'am. I'm sorry, do you need to repeat the question, Ms. Badu?
Yes.
Can we have a read back on that question?
Now, in your petition, you indicated, you indicated that you were attempting to model behavior for her. This is at AGO 100. Are you claiming that your boundary transgressions were a misguided attempt to model behavior for her? Answer, yes, they were.
Thank you.
Your Honor, I don't have any further questions.
Mr. Leatherberry, do you have any questions?
Just a couple of quick questions. Dr. Tess, your role in doing presentations at these various groups you've discussed, has that impacted in any way your willingness or openness to approaching others and talking about what has occurred?
Yes, that, I believe, has been one of the things that's allowed me to further reach out to people that maybe did not know about what I've done. To go up in front of that audience of my peers, again, peers that I've maybe known for years, if not decades, I felt like if I could do that, I could certainly approach other people on a one-to-one basis that I knew in the community.
And you were asked earlier about consultation. How often would you say now that you consult with somebody, let's just put it that way?
Well, I mentioned my wife. Quite frankly, we probably consult every day now about issues involving what's going on in my practice. And that's kind of the result of me reaching out to her a lot more. And quite frankly, I think, she wants to just make sure I'm doing things the right way. And so probably almost on a daily basis, we check in with each other, just, how am I doing? How is she doing? Is any stuff coming up with any clients? And then certainly with my office partners, I have two others, I probably once or twice a week certainly talk to them about whatever might be going on, just running something by them. And then I have certainly the colleagues in the community, some of them who are here today, who I talk to on a fairly regular basis.
So about how many times then, putting those together, would you say that you consult with someone regarding your practice, regarding care issues?
Well, like I said, it'd probably be, at least probably several times a week at this point.
And you were asked earlier about whether or not you have a formal consultation group. What would be different about a formal consultation group from the consultation with the individuals that you've described?
Well, I almost think while a formal consultation group is very good, I do feel that the way I've been reaching out is that allows for me to get that one-to-one feedback, and particularly people that really know my practice. And so I feel like it's almost a little bit more personalized when I'm reaching out like I am on a one-to-one basis. But there's certainly value in a formalized consultation group as well.
Is there a role, you were asked earlier about self-care, a number of questions about fatigue and how you monitor your activity level. Is there a role for self-care in maintaining proper boundaries?
That's one of the great lessons that I've learned. I mean, I knew it in the back of my mind, but no, that's something that's so much on the forefront of my thinking every day. Am I monitoring myself for how I'm doing, in terms of my readiness to see clients, how am I doing with clients, and not again just in the treatment clinical part, but in the other dynamics that can affect therapy.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, do any board members have any questions?
Yes, I do have a
Ms.
question.
Badu?
Thank you. Thank you for your sharing with us and your straightforwardness, Dr. Tess. I wanted to ask this question. How long did it take from the first kiss or hug that you shared this information with your wife?
Gosh,
Approximately.
I can't really remember. Gosh, I know I can't really remember how soon. It wasn't right away, though, I can tell you that. And that was a mistake. I know it wasn't right away. Yeah.
Okay. Last question. In retrospect, and I know what was the saying, hindsight is always 20/20. But in retrospect, what perhaps might have been about this particular client that allowed your boundaries to soften or to lax?
I think that's a very good question. I think, first of all, I've never seen a client for as many sessions as I saw her. Again, it was 9.5 years, over 500 sessions. So I got to know her, as I believe I remarked earlier, probably every detail of her history and of her life. And so I felt I knew her so well, and unfortunately knew so well all the emotional turmoil and difficulty she'd gone through her life. And I think I was more prone to rescuing her, not only because of the longevity of the relationship, the number of sessions, but because I think I got pulled into her emotional pain much more than I would have most other clients that I didn't know nearly as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, anything else, Mr. Leatherberry?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay.
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else, Mr. Hagan?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, are we ready to proceed with closing statements, beginning with Mr. Leatherberry?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Leatherberry.
I'm sorry, say. Can you turn on Dr. Tess's
And Dr. Tess has asked to say just a couple of words before me, if that's all right with Your Honor and the board.
That's all right with me.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll try to make this brief because I know we're running a long time. I readily recognize I made some significant mistakes with this patient. And it really upsets me that I did do so. first of all, just because of who I feel I have been as a psychologist, and for me to make those mistakes, it's incredibly bothersome. It also upsets me because I really, really cared about this patient. And the fact that I could have harmed her really disturbs and bothers me. And what I've tried to do is to learn from these mistakes. And I've tried to make what I called earlier to make right from wrong. Try to make the best of the situation, learn what I could from this, so that certainly I never repeat this, but that I also try to actually become even a better psychologist. And, you know, if you are willing to allow me to have the early termination, I do feel that maybe it'd be a validation from you that maybe, you know, you did recognize that maybe I did try to do the right thing in the way I've responded. And that if I was granted this early termination, maybe other psychologists would maybe view this situation and whatever decision you make, that maybe there are different ways to try to approach disciplinary action, and that maybe somebody else would maybe try to make an effort to do things in the best possible way. Thank you, and I appreciate your listening to what I have to say.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Leatherberry, do you wish to say something?
Thank you, Your Honor, and ladies and gentlemen of the board. Counsel just recently asked a number of very effective questions. They were tough questions, and it gets the lawyer in me up. I start objecting. But notice Dr. Tess's answers, and they were straightforward and honest. And keep in mind, too, that we admit to every one of those things. Yes, it's true. This was an underserved individual who had an unfortunate history of child abuse, of drug addiction. Dr. Tess crossed the line. He has not shied from that one moment, not just here today, but in the past now, a year and a half, coming on 2 years, where he has been doing public presentations where he goes into the community and says, I crossed the line. And this is why, and this is what I think has happened. Rehabilitation is measured, and we've heard this a number of times, we're not here to retry the case. When we know what happened, he screwed up. Rehabilitation is measured according to an internal subjective measure of attitude. There's the state of mind and there's the course of conduct. Clearly, we can look at what's occurred over the past, during the years of probation, and we see a course of conduct. But we want the petitioner, but the state of mind is a little more difficult to assess. We want the state of mind to demonstrate a rehabilitation and essentially a mind that is mature, measured, well-reasoned, and that appreciates the gravity of the misconduct and shows remorse for the harm caused. That is the standard today, not whether he did something wrong. The petitioner, Dr. Tess, must also show a demonstrated course of conduct that convinces the board that the public would be safe if he were permitted to be licensed again or returned to the unfettered license, the practice of psychology. Now, we look to the rehabilitation criteria described in your board packet under Exhibit, I believe it's 7, Section 5. And there we look to a number of questions. I think some of them have been clearly answered today, but I'll just cover them. The nature and severity of the acts under consideration as grounds for denial. No one has shied. Dr. Tess has not shied from the fact that these were serious violations of boundaries. The board also should consider the evidence of any acts committed subsequent to the acts that form the basis of discipline. And for that, I would like to direct you to the packet, again, that was provided by the Attorney General's Office for the board, Exhibit 3, and that would be AGO number 89. And I have to steal my binder back. And there what we'll find is essentially that the probation monitor, In going through the probation report, Dr. Tess during probation satisfied every single condition. Each time the report is condition met. We know that some of these things involve taking the CPSE and passing that, taking more than 70 continuing education units when he was required to do only, I believe the testimony was 45. We also know from the, and I'm blocking now, from the probation monitor in the quarterly reports that each time in evaluating Dr. Tess's report, and keep in mind that probation monitor reviewed over 400, practice monitor, I keep mixing those terms up. The practice monitor did over 400 case reviews. Right? So many of those would have been the same patient, but each time these are 400 incidents of pulling a file, we're talking to Dr. Tess and looking at how he was performing. And each time, his conclusion was that there was no problem with Dr. Tess's practice. He was safe to practice. We also know from Dr. Swire's report, who was the practice monitor, that his final report, which is at AGO 2122, and if you're following along, I would direct you there to the paragraph where he says, and this is the analyst, the expert for the board, despite the argument of lawyers, this is Dr. Swire saying, I would have no reservations, none, about Dr. Tess's probation being terminated, and I would not see the need for any dynamics to be in place. He also comments that Dr. Tess has consistently demonstrated a very high level of competence in dealing with his patients. This is after 400 reviews. His clinical skills are excellent, and he shows a real sensitivity to their needs and well-being. He has shown a keen understanding of what led to his being disciplined. He takes full responsibility for his actions and has shown no indication of repeating any of those actions. You'll also see in the board packet that there were 10, and then today we were allowed, thank you, to add an 11th letter of support. And these individuals, each of them has known Dr. Tess for, the average is about 20 years. I counted it together, and I think I came up with, for the first 10, there was over 200 hours of combined professional experience with Dr. Tess. Look at these letters. I encourage you to read them, and we're not going to go through all of them here, but at AGO 73, Dr. Wexler comments that Dr. Tess, and here's a word that you heard in testimony, and I think you'll hear or see as you look through the documentation. That's the word courage. Dr. Tess courageously presented the details of his case, referring to the 2015 CPA conference, and the experience of going through the evaluation by BOP. He was humble, informative, and self-reflective in ways that were extremely valuable. I was moved and inspired by his presentation. One might expect somebody with that forum, a microphone in a public forum, who's been sanctioned by his licensing board, to take that as an opportunity to vent frustration, to fight back, to set the record straight. But none of that occurred. Dr. Tess was humbled, he was informative, and he was self-reflective. Dr. Michio Fonseca at AGO 72 states that Dr. Tess has openly, without denial, described the situation he found himself in. He acknowledges the poor judgment at the time. He has been very courageous, there's that word again, in that he has presented this ethical lapse in an open professional forum with his peers and other clinical psychologists. He has offered himself as an instrument of education and lesson. His openness of his professional errors is commendable, providing a frank and direct discussion. I encourage you to read through that. There are a number of those letters. In Dr. Mary Harb-Sheets' letter, she also reports that in getting Dr. Tess involved in speaking to the CPA, just the response of members who came back afterwards, who lingered and said, this was a very interesting, compelling presentation. It's outreach to others, not just to protect patients, and we'll talk about that because our mission together is consumer protection. But finally, I would encourage you to look at the board's final investigation report by Barbara Tanner. And now you've heard the well-crafted cross-examination by counsel. But look at Dr. Tanner's report, which occurred in November 2014. It was completed in January 2015, just months after the stipulated settlement was entered into. And in that, she acknowledges some of the interviews from Dr. Hugh Pates, for example, that there are few providers in the East County of San Diego. And because of the low reimbursement rate for Medi-Cal, this limits the options even further. And Dr. Tess's services are much needed in the community. And Dr. Quinn documents that Dr. Tess, actually I think hers is worth looking at, particularly because she documents a transition from what would have rightfully been the board's concern in the beginning. She basically says in her letter that Dr. Tess wasn't really focused on the right thing in the beginning. You know, he was seeing that he was caring too much. But she saw over the period of 6 months a transformation in Dr. Tess, one that began to fully embrace and clearly recognize, and these are her words, he developed a clear recognition of the boundary violations. He reported that taking the required CPSE exam caused him to learn so much that he was glad to have done it. I would also want to ask you to take a look at, and I'm sorry, I confused two reports there. Barbara Tanner's report was done at the end of the close of the investigation. I'm thinking of Veronica Thomas, who was the board-appointed psychological evaluator, who conducted a psychological evaluation in November of 2014. And in there, and again, just you've heard these damning accusations. They were. But what she reports unequivocally is that Dr. Tess evidenced no substance abuse problem or alcohol abuse problem. There was no evidence suggesting the need for psychological treatment, so she didn't recommend that. He exhibited no predatory behavior whatsoever. She did the MMPI and found that there was nothing there to support that he was there trying to prey on vulnerable, underserved, drug-addicted, child-abused individuals. He was clearly somebody who had lost his boundaries. And what better candidate for rehabilitation? We've heard that how would he prevent this from happening again in the future? What measures has he taken? Because clearly, as was pointed out in the questions, if he was up to self-monitoring in 2012, then what makes him safe if he's doing self-monitoring in 2017? And I think he testified forcefully, and I think we were all touched by the honest emotion that came through in his getting the reality slap of his life, recognizing that he had gone way off and his boundaries were hurting somebody. So yes, that was a shock. And he also became was forced to confront that shock when talking to his wife, talking to peers, and doing these presentations. But he's not relying now on self-monitoring alone, despite that new self-awareness or awareness of the importance of self-monitoring. He has made steps to cut back on volunteering. And we talked about some of the things with his children. We didn't talk so much about, he mentioned both parents had passed, his father first, and then his mother in roughly 2011 or 2012. That also passed. He is forcing himself to take breaks during the day. He doesn't work through lunch now. He recognizes that the break isn't just for some time off, but it gives him a chance in the middle of the day for some self-reflection on his patients and how he's responding to them. He has learned to delegate, with the board, with the FQHC board that he works with. And he's more selective in the patients he takes. And then we've also heard about his ongoing consultation, where he consults with individuals, his wife daily, a group practice colleagues weekly. So when we look at the rehabilitation criteria and we ask, all right, has he met that criteria? Has he complied with probation? Absolutely. That's in the board's own documents. Has he demonstrated or given evidence that he would be safe to practice in the future if the board were to shorten probation. And I submit that that evidence is there as well. But still, were I in your shoes, the board is not obligated, you're not required by law if he meets the criteria to grant him to shorten probation. It's your discretion. Dr. Tess recognizes that. So what makes this different? Why should the board grant this request? The question was raised earlier today about consumer protection. That is clearly the board's mission, consumer protection. But in this day and age, I think we also realize that protection sometimes does not necessarily mean extreme views. It means an even hand, a just hand. Because while it may be protecting consumers to deny Dr. Tess the privilege of going back and practicing without probation, I think the board should also ask itself who's being harmed by our making that denial. Are there patients, the same patients we want to protect, who don't have access through Medi-Cal? They already are deprived of access through Medi-Cal to providers. If we are reasonably sure that Dr. Tess is, as the experts say, safe to practice and excellent in his patient care, why deprive those patients of Dr. Tess? But I think there's also another mission, another purpose that the board has here today. That's why we have a camera. This is a public forum. And the purpose is not just to protect patients, but it's also to instruct providers, psychologists who are out there as to what the board requires and to let them know that there are standards that must be met. But we don't often get the chance to tell providers what the board looks for in rehabilitation, what is expected. When people come here today or come to this table and they ask for rehabilitation, what is the measure of rehabilitation? And I submit to you that Dr. Tess has come today presenting a model, a very acceptable model of rehabilitation. Someone who has not just given lip service to admitting what's occurred, but he is someone who has essentially explored the depths of the soul, trying to figure out what went wrong. He has put himself in a place of such pain, it's hard to imagine standing in a convention room with peers from around the state of the most esteemed organization, professional association of your peers, and standing there and saying, I made a gross mistake, and I potentially hurt a patient. I need you to know about it. I need you to know what I think caused that to happen. I need you to know what I think needed to change and what I've done to change it and how you can learn from it. And as Dr. Pate said, he has made himself an example of instruction. And I think that should be recognized. At least I would encourage the board to make that part of their analysis in deciding whether or not to grant Dr. Tess the privilege of shortened probation. And I would ask that you do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Counsel. Mr. Hagan? Well, let me just ask, what's the AG's position on this case?
The AG's position on this case is, I'll address that at the end. If I could go ahead and just take it from the beginning on my oral or closing statement?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the facts in this case are generally undisputed, as counsel indicated, and to Dr. Tess's credit, he has admitted to all the misconduct. And the question the board now has to consider is whether or not he's met his burden of proof of that the board should go ahead and move off the current term of 5 years that had an effective date of September 17, 2014. In answering this question, I'm going to raise some of the same points that I did in my earlier argument today, that first the board needs to consider the burden of proof. It's a very high burden of proof that the person who comes before the board has to go ahead and meet in order to establish that they've been fully rehabilitated. And it's a clear and convincing level of proof that the petitioner has to go ahead and offer. The second point relates to the nature and severity of petitioner's repeated misconduct in this case, and that is one of the factors that the board can consider. This wasn't an isolated incident, but this was, in fact, an admitted serious course of conduct of a series of boundary violations that were they were rather reckless concerning the complicated history of this particular patient. They lasted from approximately 2007 to 2011. I'll just go over them briefly. That the petitioner had physical contact during the course of his therapy sessions with patient CM. He would allow her to place her head on his shoulder, and he would wrap his arm around her shoulder. There were approximately 10 occasions that he either hugged her and or held her. He indicated that when he would hold her, that sometimes it would last an estimate of 2 to 3 minutes. When we look at it, if I were to start the clock right now and say, let's go ahead and run off 2 to 3 minutes, that's a very long period of time, especially in light of the fact that this was a patient who had suffered prior sexual abuse and physical abuse and had abandonment issues with her family. Petitioner also allowed the patient to smoke marijuana in his office while he drank alcohol on the evening of June 26, 2009. He allowed her to do this in response to an alleged crisis she was having, and this occurred at 6:30 in the evening when there was no other office staff around. And during this encounter, patient CM lit up a pipe with marijuana, and petitioner permitted her to smoke the marijuana in his office despite her history of sexual abuse. And during this encounter, he had a brandy and 7-Up while patient CM was getting high. Now, at the end of the office visit, petitioner took patient CM also to Baskin-Robbins for ice cream and then drove her home. Now, mind you, none of these professional boundary violations or any of this conduct was documented in his chart notes. That was the first failure to document. Petitioner, the record will show, also attended a commitment ceremony at some time between 2009-2010 and gave the patient CM a gift of $25, which was followed the next day by $5. Then there was a kissing incident of November 16th, 2010, and once again, this incident occurred and it was not documented. That was the second failure to document. And then 1 week later, we had a discussion with a patient with a complicated history who may not even known what the heck was going on. I'm sure there's a lot of confusion associated with this. And it was a person with a very disparate relationship with the professional and with the patient. And he's making the judgment that she's okay with this. And again, there was no effort to document this. There was no effort to go ahead and refer out, which raises some big red flags. And again, failing to document the kissing incident, this was the third failure to document. And then you had the visit with the patient and her sister on December 28, 2011, where the sister had indicated that this had been a very rough experience for patient CM, and there was a discussion about, do you want to continue therapy, do you want to not continue therapy? Obviously very relevant to be documented, and this was the fourth time that there was no documentation. Now, not surprisingly, all the stuff that was not documented was information that reflected directly on Dr. Tessa's professional misconduct. And as I mentioned, the patient did have a very complicated history, molestation, sexual and physical abuse, abandonment by her family, prior suicide attempts, suicidal ideation. She suffered from depression, and there were repeated boundary violations in this case with a very fragile patient. So, when you look at the rehabilitation evidence that was submitted by petitioner, you all heard it there. He did address these things. He was fairly direct when he did it, but there are some concerns that he was not fully accepting responsibility when you look at his petition. And in many instances, when he talks about his misconduct, he sort of gives qualified acknowledgments or qualified admissions. At page AGO 13 of the record, he tries to indicate that, well, this really happened when I was attempting to model behavior. In another incident at page 13 of the record, he claims that he was trying to protect her from other adverse consequences. And in response to the issue of the hugs and holding her, he indicated that, well, those were in response to her request, as if it somehow excused his misconduct, which it clearly doesn't. He also claimed that there was extenuating circumstances that existed, which certainly were not present. So the board should keep all these facts in mind, should look at petitioner's numerous or repeated incidents of professional misconduct that occurred with a female patient with a complicated history. Should look at the fact that petitioner engaged in a pattern of misconduct with CM that lasted over a period of approximately 2.5 years, and the conduct was reckless, and despite what petitioner may claim, there were no extenuating circumstances for his misconduct. And as I mentioned, while petitioner has admitted to some of his misconduct, many of the admissions were qualified, and in part, he attempted to shift some of the blame to patient CM. And with that said, I will submit the matter to the board. I respect the board's discretion on this matter, and I will leave it up for the board to decide if they think that the burden has been met to go ahead and reduce or modify the probation in this case. Thank you.
Anything else? I'm sorry, anything else?
As petitioner, I'd like 30 seconds on
You got 30
reclose.
seconds.
I would just point out that looking apart from the allegations from a legal perspective, there's a clinical issue. You want to get at what is he really thinking? Is he safe? And where best to go than the experts that the board has asked to make that evaluation, and particularly Dr. Tanner's report, which was in 2014, and all of the rehabilitation evidence you've heard today occurred in the 3 years after he was determined to be safe to practice. Nothing further.
Well, Your Honor, just one final point, and I'll make it very quick.
You got 5 seconds.
Let's go ahead and say that as far as a practice monitor is not an expert, and there was no expert that did come and testify before the board today that was subjected to any cross-examination. So with that said, I'll go ahead and rest.
Okay. With that, thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations, and good luck to you, Dr. Tess. This matter is submitted and the record's closed, and the parties will receive the board's decision in the mail. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Good meeting.
In a second, so are we ready to go on the record, folks? How's our core reporter, who's been working overtime for us, doing?
I just ate an apple, my sugar came back up.
Well, you got to get the real stuff at the desk, the cookies.
Otherwise, he could pinch you every once in a while.
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, we're on the record in the petition for early termination of probation filed by Barbara McDowell, case number 600-2017, 000-803, OAH case number 2017-090-282. Today is November 16, 2017, and we are in San Diego, California, and we are before a quorum of the California Board of Psychology. May I have your appearances, please?
Rosemary Luzon, Deputy Attorney General, appearing on behalf of the Attorney General of the State of California.
Good afternoon.
Barbara McDowell.
Good afternoon, Dr. McDowell. I have a packet of proposed exhibits, pre-marked 1 through 8, and I'm prepared to receive these into the record as evidence, absent any objection. So I don't hear any objection, so exhibits 1 through 8 are admitted. And we'll start with petitioner presenting her case. Petitioner has the burden of proof here. And Dr. McDowell, I assume you're going to want to testify?
Yes.
So I'm going to swear you in.
Okay.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the state of California that the testimony you'll give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
And please state your full name for the record.
Barbara Ann McDowell Say.
Okay. And, well, this is your petition, and what would you like to say about the reasons why you believe the board should terminate your probation early?
Well, I'd like to thank you all first for hearing me today, particularly because it's so late. I'm glad that you didn't send me home to come back later. It's my understanding that the intent today is really to explore evidence of my rehabilitation and risk for reoffense rather than rehashing the details of the case. And I'd like to discuss with you my personal approach to probation and rehabilitation process. I've taken this process very seriously. I've completed all aspects of my probation that was put before me, including 15 or more hours of continuing education in law and ethics each year, in addition to the continuing ed required by my license renewal. I participated in an educational review. I also participated in an ethics class. I paid all of my fees to date and submitted my quarterly reports. But really, that was the easy part. Just the checking the boxes and doing the things that were put before me. I think most people could do that part of probation. Whether or not you come out on the other side of that with greater insight and greater awareness and facilitating a true change is more of an individual matter. So I've approached this process with openness and a willingness to learn and to change. When this whole thing began several years ago, my initial approach was really that to defend my actions and I wanted everybody to know that my intentions were true, certainly didn't mean any harm, and I really went into a defense mode. And at some point, there was a conscious shift that happened. And for me, that happened when I decided to settle the case and then when I decided to accept the terms of probation. I had a decision to make at that point. At that point, the decision was really, do I go through the motions of probation and again just check the boxes and be done in a few years? Or do I learn from this process? And do I make it mean something? And for me, the process is very difficult. The probation and the investigation process is a very difficult process. So I wanted that to be meaningful. And I made a conscious decision then to shift away from defending my actions and to shift to exploring what happened and what did I do and what can I do moving forward to prevent that from happening again. So that was really my decision. My decision was not just to check the boxes, but to really develop some insight and be very thoughtful and insightful about this process as I went through it. So my focus shifted to what were the risk factors that put me and others in a vulnerable position in this case? What were the missteps that I made early on and throughout the process? And as I mentioned, my good intentions, while they were there, didn't really matter. What really mattered was what I did and what were the errors that I made. So to explore these issues, I really had to spend a lot of time kind of digging deep and figuring out what went wrong. What I learned from this process is early on there were some fundamental errors that I made. There was a dual relationship that existed between the child's mother and myself. And that dual relationship reduced my objectivity and impaired my clinical decision making. In my desire to help her clouded my judgment. And early in this process, when I was approached to see this child, I recognized the dual relationship and I recognized the concerns and I gave referrals. And when those referrals didn't work out or weren't accepted, I gave additional referrals. And when those weren't accepted, I wavered on my initial decision to not see this child. And that was really the first misstep. And in an attempt to reduce the risk, I had my psych assistant or asked my psych assistant to see this child. Again, that didn't reduce any risk, actually. And my dual relationship with the mother really impaired my ability, and my desire to help her really impaired my ability to stay objective and make a better ethical choice.
So addressing these early issues would have prevented most of the other missteps that happened along the way. Other issues that came up in this case is there was not adequate consent. And while there was a court order that stated only one parent needed to give consent and the other needed to be notified, while that may have been legally enough, it was not ethically enough, and consent from both parents should have been obtained. There was also not adequate record keeping. This child was seen 2 times, but that did not lessen my or my psych assistant's responsibility to maintain adequate records, clinical and billing records. There was also a declaration that was signed by myself and put into family court. This was done with only the mother's consent and not the father's consent, and that was an error on my part. How this probation process has helped me has been in a lot of ways. Really, the most helpful part of probation was the educational review with Dr. Slay. And if I'm being completely honest, it was the part that I sort of dreaded a little bit when I knew that I was going to have to do that. I think because I just didn't want to get back into the thick of it, but sitting down with him I found to be immensely helpful. His focus was really on reviewing my risk factors, not only for this particular situation, but potentially for other situations that will come up in my practice. I have a pediatric neuropsychology practice. I see children and families every day. And there are complex ethical and legal situations that come up. And he was really helpful in reviewing those with me and helping me determine what I can put in place to reduce my vulnerability moving forward and that vulnerability of my patients moving forward. So I thought that was very helpful. I've also, as I mentioned, attended all of the continuing education seminars. Some of those are super helpful and some of those were a little bit less helpful. I mean, the quality really varied. But what became very clear as I attended those was the need to attend them, the need to attend in-person seminars in law and ethics, because people interpret law and ethics differently. And even when the same issues came up, the examiners may, or the presenters may interpret them differently. And new things came. Every time I went to a seminar, there were new things that were discussed. So I found it very helpful just to go and sit in person for 6 hours at a time and really delve into the issues that are relevant to my practice. Also, while this was not part of a requirement for me in probation, I also started to do regular and consistent consultation with colleagues. And that was helpful because these are people that know me and that know my practice, and I know them, obviously I know their practice, and so we would sit down, and while I did previously consult regularly for clinical issues in cases, we really integrated a significant component of law and ethics into that consultation and have found that very helpful as I've gone through this process. So some of the specific changes that I've made, I have implemented improved practice guidelines with respect to consent and release of information in my practice. In all situations, where possible, I obtain consent from both parents, and by where possible, I mean if both parents are alive and have involvement with the child, I obtain consent. In fact, there have been situations where I was unable to obtain consent from both parents, and then I did not see the case or see the family. So I've implemented new guidelines for consent and release of information. I've also improved overall office practices with respect to confidentiality, discussing that with patients, being clear about when confidentiality is maintained and when it cannot be maintained, around the use of technology with respect to computers, email, cell phones, etc. With respect to record-keeping procedures, both billing and progress notes, I have, for myself, implemented a very specific and scheduled time that I do my progress notes and keep my billing records so there's no lapses in that progress. And in our office, we have improved layers of security with respect to soundproofing and confidentiality. While these are really not issues necessarily that came up in this case, these are issues that came up through the continuing education seminars that I attended that were relevant to my practice. I also have two times a year, I have meetings with everybody in my practice where we review the HIPAA guidelines, where we review all of the ethical and legal issues that come up for us. And over time, things can get a little lax. And it's been really helpful to every 6 months go back and just walk through the office and talk about the things that really need to be tightened up. I'm continuing to do frequent consultation on clinical cases and discussing law and ethics, like I mentioned. I also, and I think this is a very important part for me, I have continual monitoring of my own personal reactions that impact my clinical judgment. And because that was a big issue early on in this case, my desire to help this child and her mom and that dual relationship really had a significant negative impact. So I continually monitor my reactions to patients, my reactions to families, how that's impacting my decision making, and I'm doing that through case consultation with my colleagues. I will continue to take annual live CEUs on law and ethics even after this probation. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Annual live continuing education seminars even after the probation is over, because like I said, while it's not a requirement for license renewal to have live CEUs in law and ethics, I think it's really valuable. And I'm happy to say that those colleagues who have attended some of these seminars with me, I think share that view. At least that's what they've told me, share the view that they find the value in that. So I think it's been helpful even to those around me.